Hey, welcome to the channel. My name is Lisa. You may know me as YV Edit on here, maybe on TikTok. Either way, I'm so happy to have you here because we are talking about a very important topic today. And as you know, on this channel, we talk a lot about women's and gender issues, and we do so often through the lens of media. We do so by looking at stereotypes portrayed in media. We do so by examining the sources that our media comes from. And for that reason, I just thought it would be extremely important to do a big breakdown of media and how it affects your life and perception. So welcome to your very comprehensive media training. The philosopher Plato was actually notorious for his distrust in images and their sources, the people that produce them. He really believed that images are flawed in the sense that they always come with a distortion. They always distort reality a little bit. And you can't really argue with him there. And the real problem with images in Plato's mind was that they both resemble and differ from the real thing. So that there's always like some truth to it, but there's also a lot being left out. And I completely agree with that. When our media becomes saturated with just one type of content or perspective, then it's very easy to delegitimize and ignore other very valid and very true perspectives because they are not being given a voice. Now, I think that we can all agree that not only would a world without images be boring and depressing, it also just isn't realistic at this point, really, for any of us to disavow imagery. It's everywhere. It is absolutely everywhere, and it seeps into everything that we do, as well as the things that we experience and how we process those experiences. So in my opinion, rather than, becoming a hermit or wearing like horse blinders or whatever so you don't look at any ads or images, the more helpful and appropriate route is to instead try to understand it and try to understand how you interact with it. Plato's own imagery of the cave, right? If you're not familiar with it, I'll put a link to an explainer video or article. But in his own imagery of the cave, he encourages us to not just look at the shadows on the wall, but to rather turn around and find their source and find whether they are coming from a truthful source or a source that's trying to deceive you somehow. What is the truth behind those images, and where are they really coming from, and what is those people's purpose for showing it to you like that? And like I said, that's exactly what we're here to do today. So my thesis for this video is that in order to understand and properly interact with media, we must first understand its source, the bias of that source, and how we interact with both of these things. So we also need to understand ourselves. Okay, so let's break that down a bit using some definitions. When I talk about media, I'm talking about the main means of communication regarded collectively. And the source of that media is not only how we receive it, but also who is creating that media, right? So we receive our media via publishing, broadcasting, the internet, film, etc. But the real source of it is just other human beings, some of which are even our peers. When I talk about bias, I'm talking about personal bias, so the bias that comes from you that you may have because of your life experiences and how certain things have played out in your life, versus the bias that media comes with, which is often crossing the lines of propaganda because of how our media works and because of how we ourselves interact with it. And finally, when we talk about the self, I'm talking about not only your own distortions and biases and things like that, but also your levels of consciousness and the amount of lived experience that you've had. And what did you learn from that experience? And how does that play into how you interact with media and what you carry into your life from that? So let's talk about media and its sources. And we're going to hang out here for a while because there is a lot of media that we receive via many different sources. And it is very important that you are aware of everything that is media and everything that is images and everything that you should be, as Plato sort of encourages us, a little bit distrustful of and always looking for a second perspective or opinion on, and always seeking out where is this information coming from, what is its source, and what is the source's bias, and what is my bias, and what is the result of these two different biases interacting together. So when I say sources of media, probably the first thing that comes to mind for most of us is film. And when I say film, I mean really anything that can be captured and rebroadcast, including this video. So you have movies, you have television shows, you have advertisements that play during those things. You have social media. So YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, even, all of those are sources of media that you are taking in if you are using these social platforms. Then there is, of course, pornography as a source of media that a lot of people consume. We'll circle back to that. Obviously, there's photography and illustrations, as well as documentaries, which represent history, which is another source of media that we'll talk about. So everything that I just went through and named off is a type of media that you, your peers, those younger than you, those older than you, all consume on a regular basis. The statistics are there, especially for the pornography consumption. It's very much being consumed. But we're also spending a ton of time on social media apps, obviously. And that's in addition to watching TV, to watching movies, in addition to the advertisements that are snuck into all of those things, how people are photographed and the differences, the gender differences within that. There's really so much to unpack in this first, section of media alone. So I think it's safe to say that we're quite literally immersed in it, and we are consuming it, we are consumed by it, vice versa. And so it's very, very important to know not only how this is affecting you and your perception of yourself and of others, but it's also important to be aware of how this affects the perception of you out in the real world. Again, especially if you are a woman. So let's talk a little bit about how women versus men are presented in these visual types of media. So when it comes to film, there's very much a way that women versus men are presented in film. This includes all the genres and subgenres of film. By and large, women are very much objectified in film. And it starts with, needing to be rescued in action films. It starts with women in action or even drama films being like the sacrifice or the reward for a man. She's just like a plot device for his personal growth or for his hero's journey. Whereas men in those same films are presented as having a lot more agency. Whether they are the hero or the villain of that movie, they are powerful, they have their own motives, they're not existing on anybody else's timeline. They're not necessarily being objectified because in some ways the movie is more about their humanity than it is about a certain event happening. Do you know what I mean? A lot of times men are presented in films to have this depth that we don't really see in real life. It's presented to be this he acts like this, but really he feels like this. When we know in real life that's not really true, and most people are exactly how they act. There is no angel sitting inside somebody acting like a total demon. That's not usually the case. But a lot of times the men are given a bigger pass on that in movies. There's also this idea that they're acting a certain way because, and it really excuses their behavior, whereas women don't really get that same courtesy. It's always sort of counted against you. And these kinds of stereotypes and story arcs persist even in films that are supposedly catered towards women, like rom-coms. A lot of the times, a man is still the protagonist in a rom-com. And there just seems to be no way around this. There are very few films that are written from a woman's perspective by a woman. When you turn around and you see who's making the shadows on the wall that you are enamored by as a woman, the rom-coms that you're watching, it's usually a man. it's usually a man. Or it's a woman with internalized misogyny. That's the only reason they're letting them make those shadows on the wall for you. And this, of course, starts the whole conversation of the male gaze and how we are all really living in it, even women. And that's why films that are made from like a female gaze type perspective tend not to do well, even with women, because we're all afraid of what the man inside our head will think about us liking certain types of media. And it's also difficult to even feel like any piece of media is truly like devoid of the male gaze. It's difficult to feel that way. Even media, like I said, that's made by women, it's often very much still caters to what we're all used to. When it comes to reality television, right? The kind of reality television that's made for women versus men is very different, right? The type that is made and catered towards women is about romance, it's about looking for love, it's about how like I just can't be without a man and I need to find a man and things like that. Whereas the reality TV that is geared towards men is very much centered only around men. It'll be like wrestling, it'll be like football, it'll be like sports, that's men's reality TV. Even though a lot of it, and some that people may not even be aware of, but a lot of it hits the same type of beats. It has a storyline. There's a little bit of kayfabe going on where certain things are pre-planned and certain things are going to happen. And it's fun. It's entertainment. It's not actually like real sports in the way that it would be played in real life. It's very much like hyped up and certain imagery is presented and value within those media that give men a certain idea about themselves and give women a certain idea about themselves as well. Of course, when we talk about social media, the kind of social media that's geared towards men versus women, right, reinforces certain stereotypes about both men and women in the opposing gender's mind, right? In the opposing gender's overall perspective, because they are simply not shown the other side of the coin. So they don't know, they don't have that perspective. So men think that social media is one thing, and then women think social media is another thing. And it's frankly very disharmonious. And of course, all of these biases and perspectives are at their most extreme in pornography, where women are very much viewed as objects, receptacles, things to abuse, things to use, things to just like throw away when you're done, versus men who are presented as strong, powerful, dominant users, source of pain, source of humiliation, and the woman is just a receptacle for all of it. It is one of the biggest sources of media that, in my opinion, contributes to the abuse of women in our society. It is one of the biggest evils that we are dealing with. I used to be like, okay, well, it's not a big deal. Like, obviously people are going to watch it. And now I'm like, no, it should literally be made illegal. And that is thanks to Gail Dines, whose foundation I will tag in the description of this video. Please check her out. Check out the resources, attend one of the conferences. My husband has signed us up in the past, and the reality of it is very, very stark and very, very bleak. And we need to get together as a society and really do something about that. When it comes to like images and just how people are photographed, right? For the covers of like films, for the covers of magazines, for Instagram posts even, should always think about how women are asked to pose, to dress, to appear. They're often asked to appear small, childlike, and at the same time really over-sexualized. Whereas men are typically presented as big, strong, fit, intimidating, serious, alpha, dominant. Their sexuality is represented as strong and powerful and dominant and alpha. Whereas women's sexuality is represented as innocent, childlike, small. It's very disturbing. Another source of broadcast media that we are constantly exposed to is music. And it is very important especially as a woman, to be distrustful of those sources and to turn around and not just look at the shadows, but look at the source of where it's coming from. A lot of our music, even that is performed by female performers, is written by men. It's written by male writers and produced by male producers. The music videos, everything like that. And they are trying to send a message from their perspective. So even when the people performing these hits look like you, a lot of times behind them is a team of men. And that's who's really making the shadows on the wall for you. So when it comes to music that's performed by women, there is a lot of self-objectification because that's what tends to do well. And there's a lot of like male gaziness to their music because that is what tends to do well even among women. And as we've seen with Nicki Minaj, Meg Thee Stallion, anytime that they try to pose themselves as a threat or sort of enter the male side of the music industry, they are sort of just completely ignored. Megan and Nicki have both been putting out diss tracks. And the only time that we stop and as a culture really examine or give any weight to diss tracks is when they are being exchanged between two men. Whereas on the male-dominated side of the music industry, there is a lot of self-objectification as well, but it is more objectification of the male member and it as a weapon. And it as a source of pain and humiliation for women at women's expense in order to establish the man's dominance among other men. When you think about it, that really is the basis and the source of a lot of the music and songs that are performed by men. And I'm not just talking about rap. This happens in every genre of music. And the result of that is that girls see that growing up. They see that when women try to fight back, it's not taken seriously. It's not even acknowledged. Women's like slights, opinions, their beef, their diss tracks, whatever, it's just simply goes unacknowledged. Maybe other women are into it, but men will never say anything. Like they'll never admit to being dominated by a woman. And they'll just keep putting out music that objectifies women, that makes sex seem like some kind of a dangerous weapon, some kind of humiliation ritual, some kind of like violent experience, and everybody will just move on. That's how it goes. When it comes to publishing, which of course includes books as well as textbooks, as well as print advertisements, things like that, we also notice some significant differences on the side of men versus women. Obviously, most of the books that we have from back in the day were written by men. So a lot of our preconceived like notions and ideas came from men. A lot of the stuff that we learn as it's just, part of life, that was actually written from a man's perspective. There are entire subreddits dedicated to like women written by men, unrealistic depictions of women in books. And men are not privy to the inner world of women. They paint women in the male gaze, even in books. Not only that, but it's typically the same kind of story arc as it is in film, where the male character is the only one that gets any sort of arc, any sort of redemption story, and women are just there as plot devices for his agenda. And there's just a huge disparity and lack of books written by women, especially, older books where women were able to document their actual experience. We have very few remnants of that, of how women used to be perceived in the world, of how they used to perceive the world, and it's a real shame. And what's even more of a shame is that women used to not even be able to communicate these things because they weren't taught, they weren't seen as a priority to teach how to read and write and how to communicate well, basically. They were just left out of academia for centuries. They were left out of being able to pass on and communicate and write about their experiences, which is pretty harrowing when you really think about it. Like, that should haunt you at night, because that's crazy. That's like basically a mass silencing of half of the population that we will never hear from again because they're gone. And this, of course, very much seeps into history and our perception of history and men and women in history, and just how they used to exist in general. Like, all of that is skewed by the source of that media, which again has been typically men. And even to this day, even though we know now that cave women hunted as much as cave men, even to this day in our media, the cave hunters will be represented by a group of men. And then when they get back to the camp, it's apparently a bunch of men and women sitting around a fire, but the women have just been, whacking off all day, doing nothing, right? While the men were out there hunting, even though the female remains have just as many battle wounds and hunting wounds and teeth marks and everything like that as do the men. And even to this day, you will see the hunters during the cavemen ages, you will see them being represented as just men. That's history. There's a wonderful creator that is at least on TikTok, so I will tag her TikTok. Her name is Maddie Swan, and she talks about how we are taught history in a very linear and unhelpful way. We are not taught to look for the patterns that precede certain events. We are just taught about the events in whatever capacity our governing body wants those events to be taught. And the reason I say that is because when somebody brings up the Holocaust versus slavery, a lot of American people, a lot of American young people and old people and children that are in school right now will probably have a more visceral feeling towards the Holocaust than they will towards slavery. And we are not going to be here, ranking tragedies or anything like that. But what that points to is the fact that whatever source they got that information from was clearly not emphasizing enough of the atrocities that happened during slavery in America, but they made more of an emphasis on something that happened in Europe. And they will have a more visceral reaction towards that than they will towards the atrocities, or mention, indigenous people. And that simply is because we are not taught the realities of other tragedies and other atrocities, other than the ones that for some reason our governing bodies approve. And that is all media that you're consuming. It's not the truth. The truth is behind you. The truth is not in the shadows that you see on the cave wall. The truth is behind you. And it's who is giving you this information, and why do they want you to have this information versus what may actually be the truth. And why are they concealing the sources and the actual truth from you? Those are the questions you should be asking. And if you don't think you're exposed, or your child is exposed to media in school, they absolutely are. Media is anything that leaves out other perspectives. Media is any type of storytelling or imagery or propaganda, frankly, that only focuses on one perspective, that freezes a moment in time without really turning that moment all the way around. It's making the moments in time very 2D, very flat, when as it was happening, it was actually very 3D, and you're just not looking at all the sides of it because of the lack of information that is presented to you. So let's pause here and talk a little bit about propaganda. What is it, and how does it seep into our lives in ways that we are completely oblivious to? Because there's a lot. So propaganda is basically any information presented to you with the intent of pushing you towards a certain opinion, or towards a certain political standing, or towards a certain worldview. And the trick to it is that this information is typically given to you in a non-objective way. It is, things are left out, things are not like fully considered in the full scope of it, and it is intended to basically essentially radicalize you in some way without giving you the full picture. That's the key word. There's absolutely things that you should be radicalized about. I believe that, especially as women. We have received so much radicalized information in one direction. The pendulum is going to swing back. You know, same with like people of color. Society has been radicalized against certain things in a way that is definitely going to cause a pendulum swing, and that's normal. But it's that initial leaving out of information that leads to the pendulum swing that we're talking about here. And in my opinion, one of the biggest examples of propaganda is gender and how we as a society interact with and what we associate with each gender, and how our distortions play into the type of media that we are being fed, and what kind of things distort our reality and the expectations of each gender when we are presented with conflicting information, right? Like a lot of men, despite no matter how many movies women make about certain things, no matter how many times women say certain things on the internet, like we like that or we don't like that, they'll be like, no, you're lying, because the propaganda goes so deep. Okay, so let's take a look at how gender has been very much propagandized, especially in America. So some examples of propaganda include testimonials. So the way that celebrities talk about gender and talk about, you know, their co-stars and things like that. Even the way that female celebrities are interacted with, it was only like a few years ago that they really started calling it out. Like the infamous Shailene Woodley clip where she's like being asked at an awards show if she's really hungry, like is she starving? And she's like, no. And the person interviewing her says, oh, well, I'm starving, like basically implying that women starve themselves for days on end, and especially the day of, in order to look the most flattering in their festival clothing or in their, you know, media appearance clothing. Whereas men just have the option of buttoning their jacket and like calling it a day. And Shailene says to her, well, you should probably eat. There's bias in the way that a lot of people responded to it, because they were like, oh, she's so rude. But it's rude to assume that somebody has been starving themselves for days just because they're a woman that wants to fit into a dress. Like, that's rude. But people saw her response as rude, which is crazy. But on the other hand, there are a lot of celebrities like Kim Kardashian that will openly talk about starving themselves in order to fit into a tight corset or in order to sort of maximize the look of something. Very confusing for little girls growing up. Similar to testimonials, there's also transfer. So associating something with a person to promote or demote an idea. So when we talk about, you know, oh, Chris Hemsworth, that's a real man, right? We propagandize masculinity. Or, you know, when you talk about socialism is bad because all of these terrible people claim to be socialists, that's transfer. That's associating something with someone in order to turn you on or turn you off to the idea of it. Same with like the blue-haired feminist lady, right? It's like, oh, apparently only women with blue hair that are not, you know, fitting into the conventional male gaze, only they can be feminists. But that's not true, right? But it makes other women not want to associate themselves with feminism because it also assigns other undesirable qualities to them, like unconventionality and like doesn't fit into the male gaze, which are also propaganda, but like it all fits, right? Like it all makes sense. You see what I'm getting at? Then there's, of course, repetition. So it's what do we give a voice to? And even to this day, you know, even though Hollywood will hype itself up and pride itself on like, oh, women filmmakers, but it's like, how many are there? How many are there really? The repetition that we get for the most part comes from male sources. The opinions and the perspectives that are repeated to us, are shown to us repeatedly, is that of men. and not of women. So even though there's some representation, it's definitely not comprehensive. And it's even worse when you talk about people of color. It's the same exact thing, where it's like, sure, we can all be really excited that there's like one or two black filmmakers in the mix right now, but we're still mostly funding projects by white people and projects by men. Repetition also exists in music. Like, it's kind of been the same old for a really long time. You know, women are supposed to be like this and men are supposed to be like this. And we hear that repeated in music over and over and over and over. Then, of course, there's the name calling, right? Women have been referred to as bitch for a really long time. And there's not an equivalent of this for a man. There really isn't. There's not an equivalent that will like lower a man down to the same level as calling a woman a bitch. Unfortunately, there just isn't. It's not the same. Dick is not the same. Asshole's not the same. Those things are not the same because they imply that it's like a character flaw or a character issue, whereas any woman can be a bitch. Any woman can be a bitch. And it's the kind of name calling that sticks, right? And a lot of our insults are also like female coded, even when we apply them to men. It's kind of like only offensive because it's associated with a woman, right? Calling somebody a pussy, for example. All of that is propaganda. It's propaganda against women, and it's gender propaganda. This, of course, happens with racism as well. Negative connotations that apply to people of color that, you know, white people use, and by doing so, legitimize the stereotypes and help to propagate the propaganda. So please don't use these like slang terms like ghetto, like ratchet, like those are not for you. And those continue to perpetuate certain stereotypes that are unhelpful and can serve to harm an entire community because you want it to be funny. And then, of course, there's emotional appeals, which is basically like appealing to people's emotion to make something seem positive or negative, right? And we see this a lot when it comes to feminism, when it comes to anti-racism, when it comes to guns, things like that. People will say anything to push their own agenda, right? They say things like, well, if we just allow feminism to run rampant, then women are going to opt out of having families. The whole family unit is going to be, you know, destroyed. That's the end of the nuclear family. Women are just going to go into the workforce, and the poor children, who's going to think of the children? Whenever we talk about anti-racism, it's, well, do you just want white people to like whip themselves on the back? Like, do you just want, you want reverse racism? You want to teach my kids that they're bad and guilty and shameful? Things like that really appeal to people's fears, you know, and people's like deep-seated insecurities. Or, for example, like this new age idea of femininity, right? And it being positively associated. But that's still an emotional appeal, especially to you women. It's like, oh, aren't you tired of just being so masculine, of being like a man, of being in your masculine, of like working and all this stuff? And it's like, yeah, we're all tired of it. But if you don't work as a woman, you simply don't have freedom. You don't have your own money. You don't have a way to leave. So it's not good to associate femininity and like being in your feminine with the liberation of women, because has nothing to do with the liberation of women. It's fine. And again, feminism would just give you a choice. It wouldn't necessarily force you to do one thing or the other, to leave the workforce, to not be in your feminine, whatever that means. It would give you that option. It would give you the option of, if you want to depend on a man, you can. Just know that that's really dangerous and often doesn't end well. Or you can have your own job and you can have your own income, and then you can see what man can keep up with you in that regard. And you can start a family out of that. But of course, if you turn around and look at who's pushing this femininity propaganda, this whole like feminism is bad propaganda, it's the politicians that don't want to divert war money into healthcare money, into childcare money so that women can go to work without it taking a hit on their finances, on their nuclear family, on things like that. The people that are making those shadows are the people that want to keep funding wars and war crimes instead of funding childcare and giving women the opportunity to go to work and to not be stuck in abusive situations where they don't have the resources then to leave. Then there are, of course, fear tactics, right? And we kind of covered this in emotional appeals, but it's almost like you see this a lot with guns. You see this a lot with like the right to bear arms. It's like, well, who's going to protect you when the government comes to take your land? You know, you need a gun in order to protect yourself. Which really, again, if you turn around and see who is making these shadows on the wall, it's just people that want to sell a lot of guns. The biggest missed marketing opportunity, in my opinion, is convincing women to buy guns. As ladies, you do need to get a gun to prevent a negative outcome. There's just too much, there's too much going on for women to not be carrying. But again, when you put everything else together, it of course makes sense because men are supposed to be heroes. Men are supposed to be the good guys. And the only reason that a woman would need a gun is to protect herself from what? From a man. And so they don't really want to say that quiet part out loud, but I will. You do need a gun to protect yourself from men. You should really look into it. I know a lot of people are not comfortable with it. I know a lot of people don't want to open that whole can of worms, but it might be time. It might be time to just start thinking about it. Another propaganda tactic is bandwagoning. So everyone is doing this and you should too. A good example of this is those like home security signs that people have in their yard that makes you feel like you also need like extra security since all your neighbors have it. Like there's a lots of subtle ways that this is like passed down to you as a consumer. Branding, the Stanley Cups, like people will check if it's an actual Stanley, things like that. And bandwagoning depends a lot too on peer pressure to support it. And we're going to get into peer pressure, don't worry. And the last propaganda tactic that I want to cover is glittering generalities. And the definition of this is using emotionally appealing phrases associated with highly valued concepts to carry conviction without supporting information. For example, when Donald Trump says, "Make America great again," things like that. It sounds really good, but there's also no plan. Like, it's just like, "Make America great again." The again also should stir up a lot of questions because what are we going back to? What's the again? Because I don't want to repeat any of this. I don't want to repeat anything in America's history, frankly, especially as a woman. So that glittering generality really largely appeals to men and white people because the only people that think America was ever great are the people that have been benefited by unfairness towards others at those people's expense. And the biggest question that we need to ask about propaganda and about its effects in our life is, how does our and other people's personal bias interact with the propaganda, and how does it make it more powerful or less powerful? Does it confirm it? Does it debunk it? What does that mean for you, right? When you hear things like "Make America Great Again," how does that make you feel versus like a 60-year-old white male boomer, right? It affects you a little bit differently. It may even be triggering for some of you to hear it because of the expenses that you've had with the MAGA crowd versus people who are like, "Oh, those are my friends." Or when we talk about, masculinity being represented by, strong, powerful men, there are probably lots of men in your life that are okay with that. They're like, we need masculine men to protect us from other, supposedly non-masculine men or more masculine men. I don't know what that deal is. The thing with propaganda is there's like very little substance or proof or data at the heart of it. It's just trying to make you feel like rah a certain way so that you will do the things that the powers that be want you to do, or so that you will buy or consume the things that are being marketed to you. It's simple. Okay, so the reason I actually snuck all the propaganda examples right here is because we are about to move on to the next aspect of media that we encounter in day-to-day life, and that is none other than peer pressure. Peer pressure is very much connected to media, and it is directly a part and a product of it in a lot of cases. And the thing about peer pressure is that anytime you act a certain way, especially in a way that's not authentic to you, that's media, and you're putting that out there. You're helping to propagate the media and the message. Examples of media-based peer pressure can include like not being allowed to participate in certain groups, cliques, activities, certain social groups because of the way that you dress or don't dress, because of how your hair looks, skin color. Belonging is very important to humans, and so when we define what constitutes belonging and what people can belong based on media, that in itself becomes a form of media, and it's a form of acting that everybody has taken on. And the peer pressure towards women generally is to be weak or cooperative, right? It's when boys pull your hair on the playground, right? It's when boys like push you down, or they're like not mindful of you. And the submissive part of that is that when you go and tell somebody about it, they say what? They say boys will be boys. And they say, oh, he probably just likes you. You just need to be nice to him. It reconfirms this like weakness and submission of women. Whereas for boys, the peer pressure is, you're not a girl. Don't act like a girl. It's, dominance, it's king of the hill, it's, competition. All of those things boys are very heavily peer pressured into, and if they don't participate, then they are told they are a girl, which is apparently the worst thing that you can be. So these are types of media that are passed down from our very lips to the children in the form of peer pressure. And this definitely transfers into adulthood and adult relationships where, the sentiment towards men when they're unhappy in a relationship is, well, are you going to take that? Like, what are you going to do? How are you going to respond? Are you going to be alpha about this? Or are you going to be a beta bitch? And for women, it's very much like, well, have you tried this? Have you tried that? No, it's probably not that he doesn't like you, even though he's acting like he hates your fucking guts. It's probably that you need to do this. You need to be nicer to him. You need to try something new in the bedroom. You need to change your hair. You need to put on more makeup. It snowballs into terrible peer pressure disguised as relationship advice. Another form of media that we all consume is humor. And this is a very big one to think about. Again, especially as a woman, a lot of these jokes are made at your expense. If you're a woman or a minority, typically jokes are just punching down on you. And that affects how you see yourself. That affects how people see you in the world. And again, the people that have been allowed to make the most jokes without any consequences have historically been men. So everybody's sense of humor is sort of tailored to that. Everybody has been influenced by humor at the expense of other people. And the type of humor that we exist in the context of really affects our lives as human beings, especially when the humor is at our expense. One of the best examples of this, in my opinion, is the "that's what she said" joke. I hate that joke, and I struggle a lot to have any respect for people who make that joke or laugh at that joke. Because in my opinion, it's very much made at women's expense. It's never empowering to women to be the butt of a "that's what she said" joke. That's what she said. The joke itself is like a vague underpinning of women in general. Like, when somebody says "that's what she said," whoever the women are in the room, our subconscious attention immediately goes to them and pictures them in those positions, right? So when somebody says like, "oh, I had something stuck in my throat," and then some dumbass says, "oh, that's what she said," in our mind, automatically, we don't associate something stuck in the throat with a man. We associate it with a woman because of the kind of pornography that we see. Do you see how it all ties together, right? We also are taught to view women as submissive and men as dominant. So if anybody's going to be choking on anything, it's a woman, right? And any time that that joke is made, it implies the domination of a woman. It implies a woman in a vulnerable sexual position. And that in itself is media. That's propaganda. That's media that's just being conjured up like this in the eyes of everybody around, right? It's a very effective way to make women feel immediately smaller, humiliated, weaker, more vulnerable. I really, really hate that type of humor. And the final aspect of media that I want to cover is perspective. Like, what is by and large the perspective that we receive our media from? Like, who is making it? And this more has to do with like male versus female gaze, representation, diversity, and inclusion. But a big part of the media that we consume is the perspective that it comes from, which can paint a certain type of message over the media that was never intended to be there, right? Certain movies, like, for example, the Barbie movie was very heavily tinged with a white perspective, right? Because it was written by two white people. So even though there was some like diversity in the casting and things like that, the main character, the Barbie, was white. The representation just doesn't go. There's still a glass ceiling of representation as far as women and as far as people of color. And it sucks because we view these things as like a pie rather than a limitless resource. So typically the representation of women comes at the expense of the representation of people of color, right? Like, we already cast a woman. She can't also be a black woman. That would be crazy. Things like that. And all of that serves to paint all of our media with a certain kind of hue. And then it's like, well, if we cast a woman, then she needs to look like this, or she needs to act like this. Otherwise, people are going to bristle against it. And we need to keep that in mind as we consume media that's even geared towards us as women or as people of color. We need to keep in mind the hands that it goes through before it makes its way to us. So the biggest question is, what does this do for us as a society? How does this connect our biases and experiences with those of others? And who does all of that benefit? I have some notes on this that I'm just going to read from here directly, frankly, because I'm getting tired. My brain's not working as well, but I don't want to make a part 2. So there is a relationship between what you interact with, how you interact with it, and how that shapes and attracts your experience. What you interact with shapes you based on the level of consciousness you're operating from because of how brain chemistry works, including dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin. You release all of these chemicals when you interact with media, with images, with representations of yourself and others. How does this change based on gender? So how do images evoke different chemicals from men versus women based on how they are portrayed in media, and what is the purpose of that? Does this affect your software or salience landscape? And what type of experiences and confirmations of bias is your brain looking to confirm in the type of media that you consume? And how does that also serve to give you a narrative that justifies your behavior based on what you've seen in the media, what you've been taught by history, what you have been taught by peer pressure, what the adults around you have taught you? For example, when it comes to men, this could be as simple as, well, I've always been taught that women like a strong man, that women like somebody strong-willed who can take matters into their own hands, and that's why I didn't listen when a woman said no. That's why I didn't watch for body language. That's why I didn't ask for consent, because men don't ask for consent. Men just take what they want. And I'm a man. I'm a masculine man. And if women can't handle that, then that's their problem. Because you've been given this narrative, right? That men are strong, they're steadfast, they take what they want. It's a king of the hill type situation. They are the dominant one in the relationship. So When you act that out, even against another person's wishes, you have a narrative in your head that makes your behavior okay. White people have the same type of narrative about people of color, where it results in a NIMBY mindset, right? Not in my backyard. We love everybody, but we're not willing to compromise our safety, to compromise our neighborhood because of what's represented in the media. What's not represented in the media is the lack of social services and support that is provided to people in this country that come across any type of hardship. Nobody shows that in the media, but what is shown is how dangerous poverty can be. But what's not shown is that poverty is a choice that our government makes every single day. There's very little media that really covers that. So where did these ideas come from? The ideas that are in the media that you consume, where did they come from? Who made this okay? Consider that an overwhelming portion of our media exists to serve and uphold the main tenets of white supremacy, as well as patriarchy and capitalism. And capitalism couldn't exist without the first two things, because then there would be nothing to sell. Consider also how much media exists just to sell you things. There's product placements, there's, celebrity ads, there's testimonials, all of these things. This is especially important for you to know as a woman, because you rarely sit at the top of any of these structures. So the things that are being sold to you are also being sold to you at your own expense. Like when women are sold makeup and lots of different types of clothing, right? That is at your expense, because you're going to spend time putting on makeup, figuring out, what clothes go together, whereas men have much more simple options for that. That's because you rarely sit at the top of any of these structures. But at the same time, it's important for you as a white woman to understand that you do sit at the top, almost at the top of one of the structures that gives you a power imbalance. You sit along with white men at the top of the white supremacy tenet of our media. In some ways, you as a white woman have been used to uphold this ideal, to uphold this type of propaganda. And you have also benefited from it. And the reason that this all affects us so much, especially the peer pressure aspect, is because safety and belonging are some of our first and most basic needs. So if somebody can sell you something based on safety or belonging, that's something that you're going to hold on to, and it's something that you're going to try to recreate in your real life to get that sense of safety and belonging. But you also have to realize that sometimes your basic needs are getting in the way of your self-actualization. If we're talking about, the hierarchy of needs, some of these belonging needs are just being sold to you. They're not real, and they are preventing you from self-actualizing, from turning around and looking for the source of the shadows. And this is okay when you're a little boy or you're a little girl, but by the time that your frontal lobe, finishes developing, by the time that you have a little bit more life experience, it's really time for you to take a look at what basic like safety needs am I holding on to, because I haven't allowed myself to realize that they're actually being made up and then repackaged and sold back to me as a woman, right? Like that you need a man, or that you need to look a certain way, or that you need to act a certain way as a woman, and that men don't. This could actually be preventing your self-actualization as a woman, right? Because if you're always focused on how you look, or how to find a man, or how to, fit into this mold that society has prepared for you, you're actually like not focusing on higher consciousness levels, on higher levels of thinking and understanding and perceiving the world. You're missing out on a lot of really good stuff. And again, I've talked about the differences in like perspective and media, and a lot of what is given to us as information about a woman's perspective is so condescending, right? It's written by men, it's misrepresented, it's misunderstood, it's objectified, in order to serve men, to serve the male gaze. Whereas men's perspective is typically the most important part of communication. It's at the heart of most of our media, is men's perspective. It's always taken seriously, supported, centered, and it results in men's perspective being so centered that they start talking down to others, which we have come to know as mansplaining. That's where that comes from. So, in conclusion, the big question is, how do you see yourself? This is one of the most powerful questions you will ask yourself. Whether you are a man or a woman, you have been misrepresented in media, and your image of yourself has become distorted. Very little of what we see in media rings true to real life or would play out the same way in real life. The best love stories would make a really boring film. Wars are not led and won by individual people, and they don't just affect the people on whose behalf they were started. Men are by and large not heroes in real life. They are not saviors. They are villains, especially if you ask women, children, or anyone that men view as below themselves. Too often, the fairy tale ending for women is just a bait and switch into the trap of domestic labor, and not a fairy tale romance with a prince, but rather indentured servitude to an ungrateful monster. And you are only treated and perceived based on propaganda that tells men they are to dominate. But at the same time, it tells them that their intentions are pure and that of a protagonist, that of a hero, that of a savior. This gives men what I've come to call main character syndrome. We'll be covering that more extensively in other videos, but this is really the root of it. Because men see themselves represented in so much of our media and in so much of what we consider to be good and pure and heroic and protagonistic, that they really transfer that voiceover, that narrative, those justifications into their everyday life, even when they are doing horrible, shitty things. They seem to think that there's always a reason, there's always a good reason for whatever it is they do, but that everybody else is, out to get them. Or that everybody else is simply just a plot point in their life, just a plot device, just a little twist or whatever. That's what causes them to see even their own relationships so transactionally and in a way that's so uninvolved and so unintrospective, because they have been always represented by heroes in movies. So they've come to see themselves as that without ever questioning it. And this is the same propaganda that tells both men and women that women are weak, that women are to be dominated, that they are helpless, unlikable, unwanted, etc., until they prove their worth to men or to the patriarchy, until they become the cool girl, they become a warrior woman, they kick some ass, that's really their worth to men, which means it's their worth because men are the only ones that get to decide people's worth. And so women are unlikable until they either prove their worth or they submit to what their worth has been typically made out to be, which is to be a wife and a mother. That's considered a good woman in our media and, according to our peers and according to history, like behind every great man, there's a woman, right? You're supposed to take your place as a woman. You're supposed to take your place as a wife, as a mother, or you're supposed to prove your worth, not to yourself, not to people that matter to you, not to other women, to men. And that worth better be acceptable to the male gaze. That worth better be transferable into something that men think is cool. So how have these ideas shaped you as a woman? And how do you see yourself in light of that? And the biggest question is, who are you really? And what do you need to silence in your life in order to get to the bottom of that? What voices do you need to stop listening to? What, are there expressions that you have as a woman that you want to put out there? Because all of this is really important, especially when it comes to what I earlier called your salience landscape or your software, which is also directly related to the law of attraction, if you believe in that. But basically, when you have these ideas that form sort of like what you look for out in the real world, according to the law of attraction, what you look for is what you attract. What you believe is what you attract. And so a lot of women, because they believe that men need to be masculine and dominant and that women need to be submissive and servant-hearted, end up in abusive relationships, because that is what their software told them to look for. So they found a masculine man who's really just a dominant asshole. They became submissive, basically gave up their voice and started blindly following the lead of a stupid man. And what they found at the end of that, what that attracted, was abuse. If you believe certain things about yourself, that's how you start to act. It's what you also start to output. It's what you also start to project. If you as a woman believe that the biggest value of a woman is her beauty, then you will likely be spending a lot of time worried about your beauty, worried about the beauty of other women, worried about how men perceive all that. And you will be attracting shallow people into your life who are only worried about beauty. You're not going to be attracting any deep thinkers into your life. You're not going to be attracting people that value you for anything other than your beauty. You know, if you believe that feminism is out here to destroy nuclear families, then the only evidences of feminism that you're going to pay attention to are those that prove that. And of course, you're going to be against feminism. And please trust me when I say that that will affect the outcome of your life. As I changed my beliefs, as I, dug deeper into the propaganda, as I turned around and stopped looking at the shadows, but started looking for the source of the shadows and the truth, my life has changed immensely. My beliefs about myself have changed immensely. I really, really encourage you to do the same. I encourage you to even to go back and watch media that you used to love, as a kid, and see how your levels of consciousness have progressed since those days, right? I encourage you to look at media that didn't make sense to you when you were younger. Like, go back and see if you have recently had maybe a lived experience that does confirm something that you saw and disagreed with when you were younger. There was a lot of feminist films and feminist thinking that just didn't make sense to me when I was younger, because I was like, no, men are nice. And it's like, yeah, men are nice to you when you're young and stupid. The older you get, the more you start, seeing and speaking the truth about men, like the role that men play in society, the less that men like you. And so you may find yourself being able to relate to certain books, films, TV shows very differently as you grow older and as you have that life experience. And as you get closer and closer to the truth, as you get tired of, putting all of your attention and focus into shadows on a wall, and rather you start looking to seek out the source of the shadows, whether that source is truthful or not, and what that source is, and how is that relevant to you as the receiver of the media coming from that source. So all that to say, we definitely need more representation in media. If you are a woman or if you're a person of color that is, inclined towards expressing truth as a form of art, please don't give up on that. Please continue pursuing that. Continue speaking truth and continue to bring your perspective so that the rest of us can see it. And if you are someone that is interested in truth being out there rather than propaganda, then don't watch media that's just made by men. Watch media that is made by women, people of color. Listen to music that's not just made by men. Read books that are not written by men. Because all of these things impact the information that is given to you in those mediums. Like, when a man writes a book and you read it as a woman and you take his advice, it's going to play out very differently for you than he may realize, or that you may realize when you are young and naive. So it's much more important for you to read about the experiences of people that look like you, because that's way more informative to you and will actually serve to self-actualize you rather than just meeting your basic needs of belonging and fitting in, which is obviously very important, but like sometimes more important than belonging is actually knowing the truth and sharing that with people that need to hear it. There's a lot of places that I don't belong to anymore where I used to be welcomed with open arms. So trust me, I know what I'm talking about. And I want you to have the same experience because it's actually very freeing and very self-actualizing versus the experience that you're going to get taken media and propaganda at face value. So I hope this helps. Let me know what questions y'all have, what thoughts come up, what's been your experience with representation and misrepresentation in media. Let's have a discussion about it and let's be mindful of that moving forward. I love y'all so much. Godspeed.